Hey there, everybody. Welcome back. We're getting close to the end here, but we're going to talk about early pagan criticism of Christianity. Today, we obviously can't cover everything that happened in early Christianity, so we're just going to look at a few instances, the first few instances in which Romans talked about the Christians. The earliest, in fact, the earliest three references, one of them is dubious, but the earliest references to Christian by pagans. It doesn't mean this is the earliest evidence that we have for Christians. There's plenty of evidence, physical and things that the Christians themselves left behind. But how did the Romans, what were the first things the Romans were saying about the Christians? So that's what we're going to deal with. Unfortunately, we can't deal with everything in the world, so that's what we're going to focus on. Now, you know that in Rome, that Christians and Jews, the poor people, they got buried in underground chambers called catacombs. They tunneled. They would have little niches in them, and people would be put there. And then you might have a commemorative plaque set up. And this happened a lot between the third and the fifth century AD. And so we have some inscriptions that I put here on the first slide. On the left, you can see this strange symbol. Most of you already know what this is, but that's it looks like an X with a P in the middle, but that's actually the Greek letter rho. So this is chi rho, which are the first two letters of the name of Christ. And so that became a symbol of the Christians, chi rho. And then you got the dove on the left side, and the dove represents the Holy Spirit. And then you've got the olive branch of peace, and then you have, I would guess this is Jesus stretching out his hands, welcoming the person who has just died. So you see a similar scene on the right. You probably have Jesus there, and you can see what I guess, I don't know, maybe the imprints on his feet. But you see the Cairo symbol there. You see the dove and the branch, and you see actually a portrait of the person who died. And so this is a Christian, obviously. He's got the Christian symbols there, so you can't not get it. And to read the inscription for you, it says Priscus, who lived for 36 years, died, functus, on 5 days before the calends of June. That's 5 days before the first day of June. His brother made, understand this plaque, in peace, short for rest in peace. So that's what the plaque says. It's full of Christian symbolism. So that we're going to look at the Christians. This is obviously from later period, probably about 400 AD, but let's look at some of the early mentions of Christians among the Romans. The first three mentions of Christians are actually fairly late, but they're talking about, two of them at least, are talking about periods that come well before. Remember, Jesus would have died somewhere around 29, maybe as early as 27 AD. And then you had the slow spread of gospel, the apostles going out. First, you've got them in Syria, and then it spreads from there through Asia Minor into Greece, and eventually into Rome. And so this is reflected there in the earliest dates. Now you have Pliny, who was a governor in Asia Minor, and he is writing back to the emperor in 111 AD about a situation with Christians in 111 AD. So he's the earliest pagan writer to mention Christians, and he's mentioning Christians who are contemporary with himself. Tacitus, the Roman historian, writing in 115 AD, so after Pliny, writes about Christians in 64 AD under the reign of Nero. And you know that Nero blamed Christians for the fire that swept through the city and destroyed a huge portion of the inner part of the city. And so there's a passage there in which Tacitus mentions the Christians in reference to the fire in 64 AD. So he's writing in 115 about 64 AD. And then shortly after him, another historian who wrote lives of the Roman emperors, Suetonius, he's writing in 122 AD, but he's writing about an incident in 49 AD, which is probably not about Christians, but we'll get to that. It's a disputed passage, is really interesting. And then he also writes about the Nero incident in 64 AD. I just put up this coin because you can look at the bottom of the front side of the coin. You see the word Nero, Claudius, Caesar, Augustus, and so forth. You see his name there and his titles. And this coin dates from about 64 AD. And it's really interesting, apropos to what's going on today. It's on the back of the coin, you can see the letters on the left side, CONG number 2, dot, which means he gives. So the CONG is short for congiarium. That is what we would call today a stimulus check. Exactly what's going on today. So this is a big bronze coin. You see Nero on the right, on the back of the coin, sitting on the curule chair. We've mentioned that before. That's the fancy chair that showed you had power and importance in this situation. You see, looks like the goddess Athena, I want to say, statue of her over there. But behind the guy in the middle, it's on the ground. This is a prefect, just an officer who conducts business on behalf of the government. And he is reaching out and handing a stimulus check, basically a direct deposit, I guess you could call it, to the Roman citizen on the left who has got his toga stretched out. The Romans often carried things in the folds of their toga. He stretched out his toga to take the direct deposit. I said Athena, I should say. Since we're talking about Romans, I'm going to say Minerva there in the background. Okay, so that's just interesting, but this coin comes from that same time. But let's go to, I'm not going to go in order here. I'm going to start with the Suetonius because we have the 49 date and then we have the 64 date. So let's talk about both of those and what it is Suetonius has to say about them. Here are the two passages. The first one comes from the life of the Caesars. This is the Claudius life, which is book 5, section 25. And here's the quote. Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he being Claudius, expelled them from Rome. And the date of that edict was 49 AD. And the second passage comes from his life of Nero, and this is the passage that relates to 64 AD, and this is what Suetonius says about Nero. During his reign, many abuses were severely punished and put down, and no fewer new laws were made. A limit was set on expenditures. The public banquets were confined to a distribution of food. The sale of any kind of cooked viands, that's delicacies in the taverns, was forbidden, with the exception of pulse, we would call it soup, I guess, and vegetables. Whereas before, every sort of dainty was exposed for sale. So all that luxuriousness that the Romans are falling into, Nero actually, king of luxury, is stamping it out with various laws. Punishment was inflicted on the Christians, a class of men given to a new and mischievous superstition. Mark that phrase, mischievous superstition. We're going to come back to it in a little bit. But punishment was inflicted on the Christians, a class of men given to a new and mischievous superstition. Period. Suetonius continues, he put an end to the diversions of the chariot drivers, ... So you can see what kind of passage it is. And what's interesting there is Christians are mixed in with the chariot drivers. And what the chariot drivers are doing, they're like the mob in New York City, shaking down businesses and people for their money. They're bullies, basically. And so the Christians get thrown in there. There's no real clear date here, just a general statement. So we'll throw it in there somewhere around 64 AD. Let's go back to that first passage. If you have to stop and read it again, do so, and then we're going to jump here and begin to talk about it. So the word at issue here is Chrestus, and in Greek, that is Christos. Okay, so that third letter, which is a long E in Greek, the third letter on the Greek word, it would be an I if it were Christos, but instead it's Christos, not Christos. And so it's very close. We're talking about Jews. Jesus was a Jew, Jesus Christ, Jesus Christ. Could this just be a mistake on the part of Suetonius, a misunderstanding? So the Latin that he uses there is Judaios, impulsora Christo, assidua tumultantes Roma expulit. He expelled from Rome the Jews who constantly, assiduously, were causing a disturbance, tumultuantes, at the instigation of Christ, with Christ being the instigator, Chrestos, I should say, being the instigator. Now, Chrestus is an interesting word because Christos, means what? It means it's the Greek word translating the word Messiah from Hebrew, and it means the anointed one, right? And the Messiah, Christ is coming, he's the anointed one. Okay, so that's what Christos would be. Christos means the good one, the sweet, kind, good one. That's what Christos would mean, Chrestus in Latin. So the most common explanation is that Chrestus is simply another spelling of Christus. That's one view. And then another view is that the reason for Claudius's edict was that there was a continuous theological dispute among the Jews of Rome. So there's lots of synagogues. Remember, in Rome, I think we said there were 11 synagogues at Rome, 11 Jewish centers, in other words, 11 Jewish neighborhoods. And there were theological disputes going on, some taking the view that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah, that is the Christus, and others didn't, which suggests that Christians were there and they were in the synagogues and they were saying Jesus is the Christ, and others weren't. So that Chrestus is just a misspelling for Christus. Okay, there's an interesting 11th, just going along with this, an 11th century manuscript of Tacitus, who wrote these historical works. And this 11th century manuscript is the basis of, at least for the passages that it covers, for all of the other manuscripts that come after. In other words, this is the oldest Tacitus manuscript that we have. It comes from the 11th century. And all other Tacitus manuscripts or copies of it, at least for the years that are covered in those manuscripts. And in one passage in the work, Tacitus says that Nero tortured people, quote, who were called by the vulgar mob Christiani, and who were hated because of their crimes. But then he goes on to say the author of this name, Chrestus, that's a different spelling, was executed under Tiberius, yada, yada. Okay, so there is, we're going to come back to that passage, but there's Tacitus using the name Christiani. So you could say this is just another way of spelling the name, an early orthography convention. What's going on here? Why does the word Christiani appear? Followers of Chrestus appear here. Does this support the reading of Suetonius that this is really Christ and that this is just another way of spelling his name, and that there are theological disputes going on at Rome over Christ, also called Chrestus, whatever. In fact, the name, the name Chrestus, is known by other early Christian writers. Two of the earliest Latin Christian writers, Tertullian and Lactantius, great Christian writers, early church fathers, you also used the name Chrestus every once in a while. They use it quite often as in their sermons as a kind of rhetorical device. They like to say that Christos is Chrestos as a kind of play on words. You even have it in the Bible. 1 Peter 2:3, you can look it up. You have tasted that the Lord is, in the translations we have, sweet. The Lord is sweet. The Lord is Chrestus, is what's written there, or in Greek, Christos. The Lord is sweet. So it's a play on the name. A lot of early Christian bishops use it. They call themselves Chrestus. They don't want to use the word Christus, of course. They don't want to call themselves Christ. So they use the name Chrestus with an E there instead of an I. We also know that messianic controversies in Jewish synagogues were common. That is, disputes over who the Messiah was or is going to be. And it often deteriorated into violent disturbances. If you happen to want to look at your Bible, if you own one, look at Acts 13, you see that Paul and Silas had preached in the synagogue in the city of Thessaloniki, and they were preaching that Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus is the Christ. And that put the city of Thessaloniki in an uproar. And Paul and Silas were staying at a house of a certain man named Jason, and the authorities and their henchmen in Thessaloniki, they attacked Jason's house. They dragged him and other Christians before the city authorities, and they continued to pursue Paul throughout Greece. So it's possible that Suetonius mistakenly thought that the riots were stirred up by a Roman Jew named Chrestus, because that name was being used by Jews. So, or by Christians. It's possible. It was a name that was current out there. So it's possible that Suetonius has some sort of mistaken idea, and he's gotten Christos and Chrestos mixed up. So the problems with, oh yeah, I wanted to show you this page from the manuscript of Tacitus, and it's interesting if you look at it closely. I hate to use any of the tools because when I do, I tend to turn a page. I don't want to do that. Uh, but if you look 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down the second word, you see that word Christianos. But it's very hard to see. It's actually scratched through. Some later scribe came and scratched it through, and in the margin wrote Christianos. So, you know, there it is in the manuscript, but somebody scratched it through at some point and tried to fix it. So the problem is if you accept the view that Suetonius just made a mistake, misunderstood Chrestus. Suetonius was a scholar, did a lot of research, and so we're going to have to accept that he didn't know that the controversies in the synagogues had to do with the Messiah. It was over Christ and not some person named Chrestus, and that he had gotten the Messiah confused with some Roman Jew named Chrestus. You see, he should have said, if he was talking about the Messiah, he should have said there, since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Christos, he expelled them from Rome. If he was talking about the Christians. Or is he talking about somebody really named Chrestus? So to think that he's talking about the Christians, you have to think that he confused Christ and Crest. If he really had Christ in mind, the way he's worded it, by the instigation of Christ, he had to think that Christ was still alive again, if that's what we're going to accept, that he really meant Christ. Even though, so he has to think that Christ was still alive in 49 AD and caused trouble. Also, in the second passage, you'll notice that he used the name Christians. So would he spell the originator of the name in a different way? So I think we have to take the passage of Suetonius at face value. Claudius, we know, dealt with the Jewish question numerous times. We talked about the fact that he banned their meetings in 41 AD and that he did expel them in 49 AD. We know this because in the book of Acts, when Paul gets to Corinth, I mentioned this to you before, he meets some people there. He stays at their house, even Aquila and Priscilla were their names. And mention is made there that they were expelled with the other Jews from Rome. So you would think if the Christians were expelled at that time, at the same time, they would certainly, I mean, the book of Acts would mention that the Christians had been expelled from Rome in 49 AD. Instead, it mentions that the Jews were expelled. So the conclusion of all that is that this Chrestus, which was a fairly common name, was probably a radical activist Jew. He was an adherent of that religious political movement, which is normally called the Zealots. You know, one of, I think, Jesus's disciples called a zealot, and it's actually a movement to throw out Roman rule, active, almost like a terrorist organization, really. Most of them were in Judea, trying to drive the Romans out of Judea, but there were groups of them, pockets of them throughout the empire. And so it's possible that what Suetonius means here seems likely is that there really was a zealot trying to stir up the Jews in Rome. And you know that Paul wrote to the Romans Christians in 59 AD, 10 years after this incident. He may have been thinking about this particular incident. He would have learned it from Aquila and Priscilla. And he warns the Christians against, number one, Jewish customs. And I think that's Romans 2:17 and following. And then in Romans 13, he urges them to obey the Roman authorities and to avoid zealotism. So, that all sort of fits together. So I don't think this first passage of Suetonius is a reference to Christianity. If the Christians had caused this upheaval for the Jews who trickled back in would have remembered it, right? But 11 years later, in 60 AD, who was on trial in Rome? Paul was. Paul had gone to Rome, and he's in trial. And the local leaders, we're told in the book of Acts, uh, the local leaders of the synagogue, they say, what is this Christianity? We've heard rumors about it, but tell us they don't know what it is. So how could there be big disputes in the synagogue, in 49 about Christ, and then in 60 AD they they barely even heard of it before, and they want Paul to tell them about Christianity. So we're going to set aside that first Suetonius passage and say that it's not legit. Here's the passage from Acts 28. We have received no letters from Judea about you, and none of the brethren coming here has reported or spoken any evil about you. But we desire to hear from you what your views are, for with regard to this sect, we know that everywhere it is spoken against. So, tell us about this sect. They don't have firsthand knowledge um, about it. Now, things have changed by the reign of Nero, which was 54 to 68 AD. Suetonius approves of their punishment. It's one of the positive contributions, he thinks, of Nero. In fact, his uh, phrase there about the superstition, uh, the evil superstition that they are propagating, those are words that they're applied to Christians here. That evil working superstition is words that get applied to witchcraft and magic. They are maleficent. That's actually the Latin word malefica, superstitio. So we get the word maleficent from it. It's a word of magic. So they're spreading magic and witchcraft and that sort of thing. That's the accusation that Suetonius is making. And you couple that with what Tacitus and Pliny both say, uh, that they have a hatred of the human race. Odium humani generis. A hatred of the human race is another phrase that gets applied to magicians. They hate the human race, and it's being applied to Christians. So what the point I'm trying to make is that it appears that in the popular terminology and the conception, the Christians were being connected to black magic, witchcraft, doing things in secret, eating babies, drowning baby, whatever, all these rumors that came out. That's that's the kind of characterization Suetonius is making. We look at that passage of Tacitus a little more closely. Tacitus is talking about the 64 AD fire. You know, the famous one where Nero supposedly uh, fiddled while Rome burned, and it was kind of clear to everybody that Nero was the one that had started it, and that began to cause him trouble. I think this is on page 175 of your book, of the Warrior book, the source book, if you want to go look at the passage. Now, we're told in the passage that when Nero did everything he could, every human effort he made failed. The gods were not satisfied. People weren't convinced that things were right with the gods. He had the Sibylline books consulted. Public prayers were offered to Vulcan, Ceres, Proserpina, and the matrons prayed to Juno. Um, he had married women celebrating ritual banquets and night vigils, but nothing could suppress the belief that the fire was started by order, by his order. So Nero tried to suppress the rumor by switching the responsibility on others. Now it's possible that the Jewish zealots started the fire in 64 AD and that the Romans, the Roman authorities couldn't distinguish between them and the Christians, and the Jews may have shifted blame to them to take advantage of the situation. But listen to what he says here. Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called the Christians. We know that that was scratched out and turned to Christians by the populace. Christ, see, that's why Christians doesn't fit, because a few words later, he's using the word Christ. Christ, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of the procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. So, did you just note two things going on in this passage? Tacitus hates Jews. That's clear from other passages in his works. And he definitely thinks of Christians as a Jewish sect. He's in referring to an incident that happened in 95 AD in the reign of Domitian. He was there, he was in Rome. Um, Suetonius mentions it. Uh, Cassius Dio, another historian, mentions it and describes it fully. This incident that took place says two members of the royal family were condemned to death for being carried away into Jewish customs. All right, before we get to that incident in 95, let's continue to read the passage. Accordingly, an arrest was made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. That's that phrase that gets used of magicians quite a bit. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths, and then you get this gruesome description. Even the Romans started to feel sorry for the Christians. But Tacitus just hates Jews and sees Christians as Jews. And we were talking about an incident in 95 where I'm going to show you that he gets Jews and Christians mixed up. So the story is comes from Cassius Dio most fully, talking about a certain Flavius Clemens. So Cassius Dio says Domitian slew, along with many others, Flavius Clemens, the consul, although he was a cousin and married to Flavia Domitilla, who was also a relative of the charge brought against them both was that of atheism, a charge on which many others who drifted into Jewish ways were condemned. By the way, the term atheism gets used a lot in antiquity up into the early modern period, not to mean that you don't believe in any God, but that you have the wrong beliefs about the God. That also counts as atheism. There weren't many people that you could stop on the street and say, do you believe that God exists? And they would say, no, that's atheism as we think about it. But that's not what is always meant by the word atheism. It means wrong belief. Some of these were put to death, and the rest at least were deprived of their property. Domitilla was merely banished by Pandataria. So the point being that these guys were condemned for having Jewish ways. The problem is that practicing Judaism was not an offense. So what must have happened is they became Christians. And so Tacitus sees Christians apparently as a really dangerous and obnoxious Jewish sect who hate the Roman race, engage in black magic. So crushing the such an already odious group of people was no problem for Tacitus. The Christians confessed, Tacitus tells us in that passage, but not to the fire, but to being Christians. Note that they were not thought to have started the fire, even in the passage. Then Nero's just distracting the Romans by exquisitely killing the Christians. Suetonius never makes the connection between the fire and the persecution of the Christians. The early Christian sources don't either. The, where that story comes from is a very late Christian author from around 400 AD. Sulpicius Severus is his name. Slide now. Sulpicius Severus was his name. He's writing very late, obviously, but he mentions the connection. He's using Tacitus, though, and he's sort of twist the passage around. Tacitus' main concern in his passage is not the Christians, it's the depravity of Nero. He could care less if the hated Christians were punished because of their hatred of the human race, because they deviated from the norms which the Romans set up for the preservation of their state and society. He doesn't care about the Christians. The deviant is writing about Nero. So, moving on to this new slide, having seen these early passages, what can we say about the Romans and their confused impression of Christians? What contributed to this? Number one, we've seen that there's a close relationship between Judaism and political unreliability of the Mediterranean. This causes problems for Christians. Um, you remember Julius Caesar tried to stamp out colleges, small associations. Christians certainly look like a college. Um, what are the Christians doing? The average person doesn't know what they believe, what their meetings are like. Their practices appear suspiciously like magic, pouring water on people and saying hocus pocus over them. It's a religion that is superstitious, comes from somewhere else. Remember, taxes came from Judea, alien to the Roman spirit. So if we just go back over those early mentions, Suetonius mentions 49 AD and Claudius. That seems to really be about Jews and somebody who's really named Chrestus. He also mentions Nero somewhere around 64, could be a little earlier. Nero doesn't throws Christians in bad company and punishes them. Suetonius is fine with that. Tacitus, talking about Nero and the fire, mentions that Nero is a bad character, tries to pervert attention from himself by blaming the Christians and torturing them a lot. And then we have this letter, I haven't mentioned yet, Pliny writing Emperor Trajan in 111 AD. Um, and that you'll find in your book, but I just want to point out a couple of things to you, and that is that when Trajan writes back, there's no mention that Christianity per se. They still have to be treated according to established laws. But there is this assumption that the name Christian vaguely connects somebody to wrongdoing, that they're causing a upheaval to the state. And just having the name Christian is a bad thing, subversive kind of thing. There's another passage from Epictetus writing, I don't know, somewhere around 125 AD. And he mentions the Galileans. And this he probably has Christians in mind when he does it. Therefore, if madness can produce this attitude of mind toward the things which have just been mentioned, but also habit, as with the Galileans, cannot reason and demonstration teach man that God has made all things new. Whatever he's talking about there doesn't matter to us right now, but he's talking about this passionate attitude of a certain group of people and calls them the Galileans. So that's an interesting early mention of the Christians. They're seen as sort of a radical sect. They believe something strong. Remember, the Romans didn't believe anything strongly. So they're suspicious of Christians for that reason. Um, but this is another interesting letter of Hadrian to Minucius Fundanus, also about the Christians. And what's interesting about it is that he is against harassing people with mob violence. Oh, you're Christians, and attacking them. Go through the courts. If they're doing something wrong, then you should deal with it. If they are being falsely accused, people calling people Christians just to get at them and turn other people against them, stir up a mob against them, and go through the court. That is how Hadrian doesn't want that mob violence. He wants people going through the court, and if it's shown in court that this is just a false accusation, then he's saying you should, punish the guy who brought the false accusation. Now, it's not clear what the Christians have to be doing to be punished, but at least there needs to be procedure. And finally, I think this passage is interesting. We've mentioned Apuleius' Metamorphoses, story about the person that turns into a donkey, lives their life partly like that. Anyway, uh, there's mention possibly of Christians in this book as well, Apuleius. I just read this quote, and you can see what you think. The banker who purchased me, he's a donkey, remember, He's been turned into a donkey, but he's telling the tale. The baker who purchased me was otherwise a good and very modest man, but his wife was the wickedest of all women, and he suffered extreme miseries to his bed and his house, so that I myself, by Hercules, often in secret felt pity for him. So the donkey's feeling sorry for his master because of the woman. There was not one single vice which that woman lacked, but all crimes flowed together into her heart, like into a filthy latrine. Cruel, perverse, man crazy, drunken, stubborn, obstinate, avaricious and petty theft, wasteful and sumptuous expenses, an enemy to faith, that is, being trustworthy, and chastity. She also despised the gods. Now, get this, she despised the gods, plural, instead of a certain religion, she claimed to worship a God whom she called only. In his honor, there's one God in her religion. She practiced empty rites and ceremonies, and she deceived all men and her miserable husband, drinking unmixed wine early in the morning and giving up her body to whoring. So the accusations there you see what you think at first, she's a terrible woman. They might just be misunderstandings of a woman who worships one God. I don't think we're talking about Jews, so it's possible, it's likely we're talking about Christians. Now, Apuleius was writing somewhere around, I don't know, 160 AD or so. So in the latter half of the second century AD, after Suetonius, Tacitus, Pliny, even Epictetus. So he's writing 30 or 40 years after those guys, and we still hear confusion about who the Christians are, even though at this point we've got Christian literature. Obviously, the average Roman person doesn't know anything about it. Okay, so that's, I know that's not a story of early Christianity, but it's a story of how the Romans were interacting with this strange religion that they barely understood, and they saw connected it with magic, connected it with secret meetings in colleges. They had all kinds of ideas when they would hear descriptions of the meetings in there about brotherly and sisterly love and so forth. You can imagine they make up all these things, and then you've got people who are adamant about what they believe, and that becomes stubbornness, and they're irritating, and so forth. And so the Christians appear to the average Roman this way. They believe something strongly, and the average Roman really doesn't have that. Okay, we'll end it there. Uh, Take your quiz and send it back to me, and I will be talking to you early next week.